There's a specific kind of silence that only exists in hospitals at night. It's not peaceful. It's not restful. It's the kind of silence that presses down on your chest like a second illness. The kind that makes the hum of a monitor sound loud, that makes the drip of an 4 sound like a clock counting something you don't want counted. I know that silence now. I know it the way you only know something after it has changed you permanently. It was a Tuesday in late October. Room 114, 3rd floor, Mercy General. I'd been admitted that afternoon with a fever of 103.4. My body had been fighting something for 2 weeks and finally lost the argument. The nurse who checked me in, a woman named Patricia with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, told me to rest. Told me fluids and antibiotics would do the work. Told me I'd feel better by morning. What she didn't know, what nobody in that building knew, was that feeling better by morning had very little to do with my temperature. I stared at the ceiling. White acoustic tiles. One of them had a faint water stain shaped vaguely like the state of Florida. I memorized it. I had nothing else to do. My phone was face up on the blanket beside my right hand. I'd called my mother at 6:43 p.m. Straight to voicemail. I called again at 7:15. Voicemail. One more time at 8:02. And this time I listened to her outgoing message all the way through. Her voice bright and familiar and completely unbothered, before the beep came and I hung up without speaking. What would I have even said? I texted my sister at 7:30. Hey, I'm in the hospital. Room 114. Mercy General. Fever. Just wanted someone to know. I watched the 2 gray checkmarks turn blue. Read. She'd read it. I watched the screen for another 4 minutes waiting for the 3 little dots that meant she was typing back. They never came. I called my cousin Marcus at 8:45. He picked up, which felt in that moment like a miracle, and then told me he was in the middle of something and that he'd check on me tomorrow. I called my Aunt Cheryl at 9:10. She let it ring out. By 10 p.m., I had made 7 phone calls and sent 4 text messages to people whose numbers I knew by heart. People I had driven to doctor's appointments. People I had wired money to at midnight. People whose children I had babysat, whose moves I had helped with, whose crises I had answered on the first ring for the better part of a decade. 7 calls. 4 texts. Total responses. 1 voicemail pickup that lasted 90 seconds, and a red receipt that never became a reply. I put my phone down face down on the blanket. And that's when Patricia came back to check my 4-line. And she must have seen something on my face, because she didn't just check the line and leave. She stood there for a moment. And then, without saying anything, she pulled the chair from the corner of the room up beside my bed, and she sat down and she held my hand. Complete stranger. A woman who had 12 other patients on that floor and had been on shift since 7 a.m. She held my hand. And I completely fell apart. Not loudly. I wasn't sobbing. It was the other kind of crying, the quiet, relentless kind that you can't stop once it starts, the kind that comes from somewhere so deep that it doesn't even feel like sadness anymore. It just feels like the truth finally breaking the surface after years of being held underwater. Patricia didn't say much. She said, "You're not alone right now." That was all. I cried myself to sleep that night in room 114, 3rd floor, Mercy General. And somewhere between the fever and the silence, and the stranger who showed me more kindness in 20 minutes than my own family had shown me in years, something inside me made a decision. Not an angry decision. Not a bitter one. A quiet, absolute, irrevocable one. I didn't know yet exactly what I was going to do. But I knew, with a clarity that felt almost chemical, that when I walked out of that hospital I was going to walk out as someone different. Someone who was finally done. My name is Nadine. I'm 34 years old. I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building on Crescent Avenue. 40 minutes from my mother's house, which is either close enough to visit easily or far enough to pretend I have boundaries, depending on the week. I am a financial compliance analyst at a mid-size logistics firm. I have been there for 6 years. I am good at my job in the specific, unglamorous way that actually matters. I find discrepancies. I read documents that other people sign without reading. I follow paper trails that other people assume lead nowhere. I notice when numbers don't add up, when signatures are dated wrong, when a clause buried in paragraph 9 of a contract quietly contradicts everything in paragraph 2. I tell you this not to sound impressive. I tell you this because it matters later. It matters more than I can explain right now. I earn $74,000 a year. I have a savings account with just over $31,000 in it that I built entirely by myself, $200 and $300 at a time, across 5 years of deliberate, quiet discipline. I have a small life insurance policy. I have no debt except a manageable student loan I've been paying down ahead of schedule since I was 28. I have a will, or at least I had one. We'll get to that. I am, by any reasonable measure, a functional adult who has built something real out of nothing remarkable. Yet, in my family, I have always been the one who has it together. Which sounds like a compliment until you understand what it actually means. What it means is the one who doesn't need anything. The one we don't have to worry about. The one who will figure it out. It means you become furniture. Reliable, useful, always there. And completely invisible until someone needs to sit down. My sister Renee is 3 years younger than me. She is the one my mother introduces first at family gatherings, the one whose accomplishments get announced in the family group chat, the one whose struggles get treated as emergencies and whose emergencies get treated as tragedies. Renee is not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. But she has spent her entire adult life being handed a softer version of every hard thing. And she has never once had to wonder whether anyone would show up for her. She has never had to call anyone 3 times from a hospital. My mother, Linda, is 61. She is charming and warm and capable of extraordinary generosity toward the people she has decided deserve it. With me, there has always been a specific emotional distance that I spent most of my 20s trying to close and most of my early 30s learning to simply map, the way you map a coastline you've stopped hoping to cross. She is proud of me in the abstract. In the specific, she often forgets I exist until she needs something. I don't say any of this with hatred. I have done too much of my own quiet work for it to be hatred anymore. But I say it because you need to understand who I was before that hospital room. And who my family had always understood me to be. The one who shows up. The one who absorbs. The one who keeps going. The one who will be fine. I had been playing that role for so long that I had almost forgotten it was a role. Almost forgotten that underneath the competence and the quiet and the never asking for anything, there was a person who was tired. Who was lonely in a specific, particular way that is different from being alone. Who had, for years, been pouring herself into people who treated her love like tap water. Always there, always available, never worth thinking about until it stops. I had almost forgotten all of that. The hospital room reminded me. And once I remembered, really, fully, finally remembered, there was no going back to the person who kept forgetting. I want to tell you about my college graduation. May 2013. I walked across that stage after 4 years of working 2 part-time jobs, maintaining a 3.7 GPA, and surviving on dining hall pasta and the particular stubborn energy of someone who has decided that failure is simply not an available option. I had told my family the date 6 months in advance. I had mailed physical invitations, actual paper invitations with the ceremony time and the parking information and a little printed card for the reception afterward. My mother came. I'll give her that. She sat in the 3rd row and she took photos on her phone and she hugged me afterward and said she was proud of me. My sister did not come. She had, according to my mother, something going on that weekend, the exact nature of which was never specified and which I learned, 3 years later at a family dinner, had been a music festival 2 states away that she and her friends had bought tickets to in February. My father, who has been largely absent since I was 9 and is therefore a minor character in this story but not an irrelevant one, sent a card that arrived 4 days after the ceremony with a $50 check inside and the words "Proud of you kid" written in handwriting that looked like it had taken him approximately 11 seconds. My Aunt Cheryl, who had told me to my face in January that she wouldn't miss it for the world, sent a text the morning of the ceremony saying she wasn't feeling well. I found out 2 weeks later, from a photo posted to Facebook, that she had attended Renee's boyfriend's birthday party that same evening. A party that, based on the photos, had involved a full catered spread, a DJ, and approximately 40 people who were all feeling perfectly well. I sat with that for a long time. That was 2013. But it was also 2016, when I lent my mother $8,000. She had called me on a Wednesday afternoon, her voice carrying that particular frequency it gets when she needs something. Lower than usual, softer, slightly apologetic in a way that is calculated to make refusal feel like cruelty. She said she was behind on the mortgage. She said it was just temporary. She said she would pay me back within 6 months, 8 months at the absolute most. She said, "You know I wouldn't ask if I had anyone else to turn to." I transferred the money that Friday. I have never seen a single dollar of it returned. I did not ask for it back. Not directly, not in those words, because in our family, asking for money back from your mother carries a specific social cost that I was not yet ready to pay. But I watched, over the following 18 months, as my mother redecorated her living room, took a cruise to the Bahamas with Aunt Cheryl, and bought Renee a $1,200 laptop for her birthday. I watched all of that and I said nothing. That was 2016. But it was also 2019. When I was removed from the family WhatsApp group. I noticed on a Sunday morning. The group, which had existed for 4 years and which I had been part of since its creation, was simply gone from my phone. No notification. No explanation. Just gone. I texted my mother directly and asked what had happened. She said it was an accident. That she had been cleaning up the group settings and had removed me by mistake. She added me back 20 minutes later with a laughing emoji and a, "So sorry baby. You know I'm not good with technology." Except that in the 20 minutes I had been removed, and in the hours I spent scrolling backward through the thread after I was re-added, I found something interesting. Conversation about me. Not a cruel conversation. Nothing vicious or explicit. Just a conversation. About my apartment, about whether I was really doing okay. About a comment I'd made at Christmas that apparently someone had found a little much, and a string of messages where my mother had said, in response to something Renee had written that I couldn't see because it had been deleted, "I know, but that's just how Nadine is. You know how she gets. You know how she gets." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. Thought about what it assumes. What it dismisses. The way it takes a whole person. Their feelings, their history, their very specific and legitimate reasons for being a little much at Christmas, and folds them neatly into a character flaw that everyone in the group apparently understood without needing it explained. You know how she gets. As if I were a weather pattern. As if my feelings were an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a signal worth listening toy didn't say anything about the messages. I re-entered the group with a smiley face and a haha no worries. And I went about my Sunday. But I filed it. The way I file everything. Quietly, precisely, in the part of my mind that keeps receipts even when my heart keeps trying to throw them away. By the time October came, by the time I found myself in room 114 with a 103-degree fever and a phone full of unanswered calls, I had been filing things for years. I had been filing things for so long that the cabinet was full. And I hadn't even opened the drawer yet that would change everything. It was a Saturday in late September. 3 weeks before the hospital. 3 weeks before room 114 and Patricia, and the silence that finally told me the truth I had been avoiding for years. My mother had organized a family dinner at her house, the kind she does 4 or 5 times a year, where she cooks for 2 days beforehand and sets the dining table with the good plates and everyone arrives with something in a foil tray and for approximately 45 minutes it looks, from the outside, exactly like a warm and functional family that loves each other without conditions. I had driven the 40 minutes. I had brought a sweet potato casserole. From scratch, not a box, because I still, even then, showed up with everything I had. I had arrived on time, helped set up, complimented my mother's centerpiece, made conversation with my Uncle Roy about his knee surgery, played with Renee's dog, and done every small social thing that keeps an evening running smoothly. I was, as always, the invisible infrastructure of the gathering. There but not seen. Present but not registered. Dinner was fine. The food was good. The conversation moved the way family dinner conversation moves. Sports, neighbors, someone's new job, someone's kid's recital. Comfortable and surface level and perfectly calibrated to never go anywhere real. And then Renee said something. I don't even remember exactly what prompted it. Something about career paths, I think. Someone had asked about a promotion I'd been working toward at the firm. A senior analyst position that I had been quietly, methodically building toward for 18 months. It was the first time in the evening anyone had directed a question at me, and I answered it honestly. I said I was optimistic. I said I had put in the work and I felt ready. And Renee, not looking at me, looking at the table, in a voice that was somehow both casual and precise, said, "Nadine's always been better at appearing ready than actually being ready." Laughter. Not everyone, but enough. My mother smiled into her wine glass. Aunt Cheryl made a sound that was half laugh, half agreement. My cousin Marcus, who had once called me at 2 a.m. because he didn't know how to handle a panic attack and I had stayed on the phone with him for an hour and 40 minutes, laughed with his whole chest. Renee looked up then. Looked at me. And she had the expression of someone who has said something they knew was a little sharp but is confident the other person will absorb it gracefully, the way they always do because that is what that person does, that is their function, that is how she gets in real time. Smiled. I want you to understand exactly what that smile cost me. I had been at that table for 2 hours. I had cooked for 3 hours the night before. I had driven 40 minutes. I had shown up the way I always showed up with everything I had. And in return I received, from the sister whose college tuition I had helped cover one semester when my mother was short, in front of every person at that table, a casual laughing suggestion that my entire professional identity was performance. I smiled and I said, "Maybe you're right," and I took a sip of water. And the conversation moved on. Nobody looked at me to check if I was okay. Nobody made a face that said that was a little much. My mother did not give Renee the look she gives people when they've gone too far. The dinner continued. Dessert came out. People laughed at other things. I helped clean up afterward. I washed 3 serving dishes by hand at the kitchen sink while my mother and Renee sat at the kitchen table talking about something I wasn't included in. I dried my hands on the dish towel, picked up my empty casserole dish, said goodbye to everyone and walked to my car. I sat in that car for 22 minutes. I know it was 22 minutes because I watched the clock on my dashboard without really seeing it, my hands in my lap, the casserole dish in the back seat, the street quiet and orange-lit and completely indifferent to the specific, precise devastation happening inside a gray Honda Civic parked at the curb. I didn't cry until I got inside my apartment. And even then, it wasn't the loud kind. It was the kind that happens when you've been holding something so long that your arms simply give out. I went to bed that night telling myself it was fine, that it was nothing, that Renee was just being Renee. 3 weeks later I was in a hospital bed with a 103-degree fever and nobody was coming. And I finally understood that the dinner table and the hospital room were the same story. They had always been the same story. I had just been too busy showing up to read it clearly. I came home from the hospital on a Thursday. I was still weak. My fever had broken but left behind the specific exhaustion that illness leaves. That heavy, scraped-out feeling where even lifting your arms takes a kind of negotiation. I had a prescription for antibiotics, a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks, and a discharge sheet that Patricia had tucked into a folder with my paperwork and a handwritten note at the bottom that said simply, "Take care of yourself." P. Kept that note. It's still in my nightstand drawer. I spent the first 2 days home mostly horizontal, on my couch, under a blanket, drinking the ginger tea I'd made in a big batch and eating crackers and watching nothing on TV, just having the sound of it in the room because silence had recently developed a meaning I wasn't ready to sit with yet. On the 3rd day, a Saturday, I opened my laptop. I had intended to do something routine. Check my work email, handle a bill, something small and practical that would make me feel functional again. But as often happens when you're a financial compliance analyst who is also the named executor of her grandmother's estate, checking email has a way of becoming something else. My grandmother, my father's mother, Grandma Rose, had passed away 14 months earlier. She was 81, sharp until nearly the end, and she had trusted me with her estate documentation because, as she put it in the last real conversation we had, "You're the only one in this family who actually reads what they sign." She was not wronged. I had been handling the estate paperwork in the background for over a year. Managing distributions, filing the required documentation, communicating with the attorney. It was detail work, careful work, the kind of work I was built for. Most of it had been straightforward. But that Saturday, opening the folder I kept on my desktop labeled Rose Estate. Active, something caught my eye that I had moved past too quickly before. A deed transfer document. processed 8 months prior. Grandma Rose's secondary property, a modest rental house on the east side of the city, valued at approximately $180,000, had been transferred out of the estate before I had formally closed it. Transferred to my mother. Not to the estate beneficiaries. Not distributed according to the will. Transferred, directly, quietly, in a transaction that had been processed during a 2-week period when I had been dealing with a work audit and had not been reviewing estate documents as closely as usual. I read the document 3 times. Then I pulled up the will. Grandma Rose's will was specific. She had divided her assets clearly. The primary residence to be sold and proceeds split equally among her 4 grandchildren. The secondary property, the rental house, to be sold and proceeds donated to her church. There was no provision, in any version of the document I had on file, for the transfer of any property to my mother. My mother, who was not a blood relative of Grandma Rose. My mother, who was my father's ex-wife. My mother, who had, I now understood, somehow received a property worth $180,000 that was never, in any legal or moral sense, hers to receive. I sat very still for a long time. Outside my window, the city was doing its Saturday things. Traffic, someone's music, a dog barking 2 floors below. Normal, ordinary Saturday sounds. And I was sitting at my kitchen table in my pajamas, 3 days out of the hospital, still tired, still fragile, staring at a document that had just redrawn the entire map of my life. I thought about the $8,000 she had never repaid. I thought about the graduation weekend. I thought about how she gets. I thought about 7 unanswered phone calls from a hospital room. And then I thought about something else. Something cold and clear and precise. I thought, I am the executor of this estate, which means this transaction went through on my watch. Which means I have both the standing and the obligation to look at this very, very carefully. I was not angry in that moment. I was something more useful than angry. I was focused that I did not call my mother that day. I know that might be surprising. I know that the instinct, the old instinct, the one built over 34 years of being the person who absorbs and accommodates and finds a way to make everything okay, was screaming at me to pick up the phone, to ask for an explanation, to give her the chance to say something that would make it make sense. I did not pick up the phone. Instead, I made a list. It was a Saturday. I was still in my pajamas. I made a pot of coffee, I sat at my kitchen table, and I opened a new document on my laptop and I started writing down every single thing I knew, every single thing I needed to verify, and every single thing I was going to need to do, in order precisely without rushing. I have found, in my professional life, that the moment you feel the most urgency is almost never the moment to act. The moment you feel urgency is the moment to document. The moment to be slow and methodical and airtight. Because urgency makes mistakes, and I could not afford a single mistake. The first call I made was on Monday morning. I called David Chen, the estate attorney who had handled Grandma Rose's documentation. I had worked with David for 14 months and he knew my voice. I told him I was reviewing the estate files before final closure and had found a property transfer that I needed to understand better. I used the language of procedural review. Careful, neutral, professional. I did not tell him what I suspected. Not yet. David pulled the file. He called me back 2 hours later. His voice, when he called back, had a different quality than it usually did. Careful. Measured. He said the transfer had been processed through a secondary filing that had come in while the estate was in active administration. He said the documentation had included a handwritten amendment, a codicil, that purported to authorize the transfer. He said it had been notarized. He said he was going to need to look at the original codicil again. I said, "Take your time. I'll wait." He called me back on Wednesday. He said the notarization stamp on the codicil did not match the notary who had handled Grandma Rose's original documents. He said the date on the codicil placed it 3 weeks before Grandma Rose's death, during a period when, according to her medical records, she had been in hospice care and had been assessed by 2 separate physicians as lacking testamentary capacity. He said, "Nadine, this is serious." I said, "I know. What do we do next?" What we did next was contact the probate court. I filed a formal challenge to the codicil on a Wednesday morning, 12 days after I had first found the document. I sat in David's office for 2 hours that day, at a conference table covered in paper, and I went through everything methodically. The original will, the challenged codicil, the timeline of Grandma Rose's medical deterioration, the notary discrepancy, the chain of title on the property. David said the word fraud carefully, like a doctor naming a diagnosis. I wrote it down on my notepad without flinching. While the legal process moved. And legal processes always move slower than the urgency inside your chest, which is something you simply have to accept. I kept working. I spent the evenings of those 30 days going through every piece of documentation connected to my family that I had any legitimate access to. Not invasively. Not illegally. Just carefully. The way I was trained to be careful. The way Grandma Rose had trusted me to be careful. I found the insurance policy, a life insurance policy that Grandma Rose had taken out in 2009, with a death benefit of $45,000, naming her 4 grandchildren as equal beneficiaries, $11,250 each. A policy that had been cashed out 18 months before her death, during a period when she had been cognitively declining and increasingly dependent on family members to assist with her finances. The policy had been cashed out by someone with power of attorney. I pulled the power of attorney document. My mother's name was on it. I sat with that for a very long time. I sat with a specific particular grief of discovering that someone you loved, someone who was your mother, who had held you, who you had spent your entire life trying to reach across a distance you didn't fully understand, had looked at an elderly woman's vulnerability and seen an opportunity. I allowed myself to feel that grief for exactly one evening. And then I went back to the list. On day 19 I updated my will. I removed my mother as a beneficiary. I removed my sister, who had not known about any of this but who had, at a dinner table 3 weeks earlier, told a roomful of people that I was better at appearing ready than being ready, and had laughed when they laughed. I removed my Aunt Cheryl, who had held my hand at 0 hospital bedsides but had attended a birthday party on my graduation weekend. I added Patricia, the nurse. I know that sounds dramatic, and maybe it is, a little. But I had a specific bequest in mind. A charitable donation to the hospital's nursing staff fund, made in her name. And it felt right in a way that I am not going to apologize for. On day 23, I contacted my bank and updated the beneficiary designations on my savings and investment accounts. On day 26, I called a forensic accountant named Sandra, who my firm had worked with on 2 previous cases. I sent her the power of attorney documents, the insurance policy records, and the timeline I had constructed. She called me back the following morning and said very quietly, "Nadine, you need to also contact the State Insurance Commissioner's office." I said, "I already have an appointment on Thursday." On day 30, I closed my laptop at 9:47 p.m., made myself a cup of tea, and sat by my window for a while. The city was quiet. My apartment was clean and warm and entirely mine. I had not spoken to my mother in 30 days. I had not responded to the 2 text messages she'd sent asking if I was okay after the hospital, or the voicemail from Renee asking if I wanted to grab lunch sometime, or the message from Aunt Cheryl that said simply heard you were sick, hope you're better. I had read all of them. I had filed all of them. I had responded to none of them. I was not ready to speak yet. I was not done building what I needed to build before the conversation that was coming. The conversation that they didn't know was coming. The conversation that was going to reframe everything. I drank my tea. I went to bed. I slept better that night than I had in years. Not because the fight was over. Because for the first time in my life I was the one who had read the whole contract before signing. They found out on a Tuesday. Not from me. From David Chen's office. A formal legal notice, sent certified mail, informing my mother that the property transfer was under probate challenge, and that a fraud investigation had been opened in connection with the power of attorney and the life insurance policy. I know the letter arrived on a Tuesday because my mother called me at 11:23 a.m. and I watched her name light up my phone screen and I let it ring. She called again at 11:31. And at 11:47. And at 12:09. I was at my desk at work. I had a cup of coffee. I had a report due by 3 p.m. I finished the report. Renee called at 2:15. I let it ring. Aunt Cheryl called at 4:48. The same Aunt Cheryl who had not picked up her phone when I called from a hospital bed, and left a voicemail that I listened to once and then deleted. She said the family was blindsided. She said I was going about this the wrong way. She said, "This is not what your grandmother would have wanted." I found that last part particularly interesting, given the circumstances. My mother called again that evening. This time I picked up. She was crying. Real tears. I want to be fair about that. I believe they were real. She said she could explain. She said the codicil had been Grandma Rose's idea, that Grandma Rose had wanted her to have the property, that it had all been legitimate, and that the notary situation was a clerical misunderstanding that could be cleared up easily. I listened to all of it without interrupting. And then I said very quietly, "Mom, I'm the executor. I read the documents. I know what the documents say." Silence. "You called me 3 times from that hospital," she said finally. Her voice had changed. "Smaller now." "I called you 7 times," I said. "From the hospital. With a 103 fever. 7 times." She didn't answer that. "I'm not doing this out of anger," I said. And I meant it. "I'm doing this because it's right. Because Grandma Rose trusted me to do what was right. And because I finally decided to extend myself the same consideration I've been extending everyone else for 34 years. She said, "So that's it. You're just done with us." I thought about the graduation, the $8,000, the WhatsApp messages, the dinner table, the hospital room, the 7 calls, the nurse who held my hand. "I'm done," I said, "with the version of this family that only calls when something has gone wrong for them." I hung up gently. Not with drama. Just done. The legal process took several more months. The probate court voided the codicil. The property was returned to the estate and liquidated according to Grandma Rose's original will. The insurance matter was referred to the state commissioner's office and resulted in a formal finding and a restitution order. My mother was required to repay the $45,000 policy value, with interest, to the estate. My share of the estate distributions, the property proceeds and the insurance restitution divided among the 4 grandchildren, came to just over $38,000. I put $30,000 of it into a long-term investment account. The remaining $8,000 I transferred to myself from a mental accounting I had been keeping for 6 years. Felt clean. Felt exactly right. People ask me sometimes when I tell pieces of this story, whether I feel guilty, whether I miss them, whether some part of me wishes I had handled it differently, more gently, more privately, given my mother a chance to make it right before the lawyers got involved. And I understand why they ask. Do. But here is the truth, and I want to say it carefully because I think it matters. I did not do what I did out of revenge. I did it out of responsibility. To my grandmother who trusted me. To the law which was clear. And to myself, the version of myself who had been sitting in a hospital room alone, waiting for someone to walk through a door, and finally understanding that the waiting itself had been the problem all along. I had spent 34 years being the person who showed up, who absorbed, who made it easy for everyone else to take without noticing they were taking. The hospital room didn't make me angry, made me honest. And the documents didn't give me power. They gave me language for something I already knew. That I had been undervalued in ways that went beyond feelings, beyond family dynamics, beyond the complicated and imperfect love that exists in most families. It had gone somewhere colder than that. And I had the skills and the standing and finally the will, to say so in terms that couldn't be dismissed. I don't talk to my mother regularly now. We have had 2 brief, careful conversations in the months since. I don't know what the future of that relationship looks like. Hold it loosely. I talk to Patricia sometimes. We connected on social media a few months after the hospital and occasionally exchange messages. She doesn't know the full story. She just knows I'm doing better. I'm doing better. My apartment feels different now. Quieter in the good way, the way that means peace rather than absence. Sleep well. I make my coffee in the mornings and I sit by my window and I feel something I don't think I had ever consistently felt before in my adult life. I feel like the room belongs to me, that if this story found you today, If something in it felt familiar in the specific private way, that means you've been carrying something similar. I want you to hear this. Being the one who always shows up does not obligate you to stay. Being the one who always absorbs does not mean you were built for it. And being underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best was never, not for a single moment, the truth about who you are. It was only ever the truth about what they were willing to see. If you know that feeling, if you've ever sat in a cold room waiting for someone who never came, I hope you remember that waiting was never your only option. And I hope, whenever you're ready, you make your calls. If this story resonated with you, tell me where you're listening from. And if there's a version of this story living in your own life right now, I hope today is the day you open the files.